Fallujah, Iraq, 3 years earlier. The air was thick with the stench of gunpowder and dust clinging to every inch of skin, like wounds that never healed. Sporadic gunfire echoed faintly in the distance, but Alpha Platoon had finally taken a brief respite after a 17-hour ambush. In a shallow foxhole near a pile of rubble, Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Ward leaned against the wall, sweat soaking through his bulletproof vest. Beside him, Sergeant Mason Hayes, his comrade, his closest friend, was wrapping a wound on his thigh without a single word of complaint. "A piece of shrapnel nearly sliced my artery," Hayes grimaced. "But lucky for me, I've got you." Elijah laughed faintly, his gaze drifting over the debris-strewn horizon. "Last time in Kandahar. Who pulled me out of a burning Humvee, huh?" "None other than this handsome sergeant," Hayes replied, then winced from the pain. They laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was the only way to survive the moment. Time on the battlefield passed differently, sometimes painfully slow like hell, sometimes too fast to react. As the sun began to set, a supply convoy was ambushed just south of their position. Alpha Platoon was ordered to split, half to support, half to hold the line. Elijah and Hayes didn't hesitate. They volunteered to go. The Humvees roared across the dunes at breakneck speed, kicking up clouds of red dust like blood. They didn't know that the insurgents had laid a trap at Junction 7. The first explosion came when the third vehicle struck a buried mine. Flames erupted, sending a shockwave through the air. Elijah barely had time to shout, "Down!" before a mortar shell exploded just meters away. Everything went dark in a flash. When Elijah came, his ears rang, and his face was dusted. He saw blood, not his, seeping through his vest. An arm lay across his chest. It was Hayes. "I'm okay." "It's nothing," Hayes mumbled, voice broken. A large piece of shrapnel was lodged in his left side. Elijah scrambled for his medkit, but Hayes grabbed his hand, stronger than expected. "Listen to me, Eli." His eyes weren't glazed over, just sorrowful. "If I don't make it, take me home, all right?" "Shut up. Don't say that," Elijah choked. "Promise me," Hayes pressed, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "Bring me back, to where my mom is, and that oak tree in the yard." Elijah gripped his hand. "I promise. I swear." Mason Hayes smiled, a tired smile. Then his eyes closed. Sometimes, the silence of a fallen friend echoes louder than artillery fire. Elijah didn't remember how he carried Mason's body, or how long it took for the medevac to find them. He only remembered the blood dripping onto the sand, and that his hand never let go of his brother's body. From that day, Elijah wasn't just a soldier. He was the keeper of a final promise. 3 years later, a flag-draped coffin was carefully secured in the cargo hold of a commercial flight. Folded perfectly atop the fabric was a single dog tag, engraved, Hayes, Mason, SGT, blood type O+, Army. Standing a short distance away, Colonel Elijah Ward, in full dress uniform, ribbons lined across his chest, stood without blinking. In his right hand, he held the other dog tag. Soldiers carry two, one for identification and one for keeping vows. The flight hadn't yet taken off, but Mason's journey home had begun in Fallujah when he fell, and Elijah spoke his final promise. John F. Kennedy, International Airport, New York, present day. Colonel Elijah Ward's steps echoed softly on the cold granite floor, in sync with the dragging roll of suitcases from the bustling crowd. He wore a full-dress uniform, shoes polished to a mirror shine, and a chest decorated with medals, Bronze Star, Silver Star, and a Purple Heart ribbon. One he never felt proud to receive. But among the thousands crowding the domestic terminal, the eyes on him weren't filled with respect. They were filled with doubt. Some glanced his way, then turned to whisper among themselves as if they couldn't believe a black man, tall, weather-worn, with a face carved by experience, could genuinely be a colonel in the U.S. Army. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking Mom, "Is that man a soldier?" The mother only nodded slightly, unable to hide her confusion. Elijah was used to that. But today, amid an honorable duty and a silent ache in his chest, it caught in his throat like a fist. He was escorting the remains of his closest comrade, Mason Hayes, the man who had saved his life in Fallujah. And as he had promised at the moment of death, Elijah was personally bringing him home, to the land where Hayes had grown up, beside the old oak tree in the backyard, beside his mother, the woman who had once said, "If Mason ever returns in silence, tell me he didn't come back alone." At the Atlantic Air check-in counter, a female employee, with her hair pinned in a tight bun, silver-rimmed glasses, and tightly pressed lips, greeted Elijah with a forced smile. When he placed the military transport file on the counter and presented his military ID, she didn't offer condolences or thanks, only glanced at the documents and frowned. "You're the assigned transport officer?" she asked, her tone thinly veiled with skepticism. Elijah nodded. "Yes, Colonel Elijah Ward. The Pentagon and U.S. Transportation Command have cleared all documents." The woman paused for a beat, then turned to whisper something to the colleague beside her. They both stared at Elijah, not with admiration, but as if analyzing whether he was impersonating someone. One picked up the phone, covering her mouth while speaking into the receiver. Elijah stood firm, hands clasped behind his back, the posture of a soldier still on duty. In his mind, he heard Hayes's laugh from a cold morning in Kandahar. "You know, Eli, that colonel badge won't help you get through TSA if your skin looks like this," Hayes had once joked, pointing at his face. "But at least, I won't let you go through it alone." Now, Hayes was gone, and Elijah was walking alone, through crowds that didn't see his comrade's sacrifice as sacred. 10 minutes later, a higher-ranking employee arrived, middle-aged, wearing a black suit, face like stone. "You're Colonel Ward?" He asked, his tone more interrogation than confirmation. "Yes." "We need to verify your information," he said, extending his hand like a command. "Your documents, please." Elijah pulled out his military ID, the Department of Defense verification packet, and the authorization letter from Hayes' family. The man flipped through each page as if hunting for forgery. "Looks valid," he muttered, "but we still need to escort you for extended security screening." Elijah held his breath. "Extended screening?" "Just procedure," the man said, lips pressed thin. "It's nothing personal." But Elijah knew better. No such procedure required a colonel to be interrogated during an honorable duty, unless his skin was a different color. He nodded, silent just as he had been in Hayes' final moments when there were no more words, only broken breaths and an unfinished promise. As he was escorted down a long, cold hallway, Elijah walked in silence. Other passengers glanced at him as if he were carrying trouble, unaware that he was holding the remains of a hero. A group murmured nearby. A woman whispered to her husband, "Is he a soldier? He just doesn't look it." Elijah didn't react. No one saw his hand clenched tightly in his pocket, where he held Hayes' dog tag. Outside the sun was shining, but inside him a quiet storm raged. The flight hadn't taken off, but prejudice, it had flown far ahead. The extended security screening room sat on the lower level, where the lighting was dimmer, the temperature colder, and courtesy noticeably thinner. Colonel Elijah Ward sat upright on a worn metal chair, both hands neatly placed on his thighs, his eyes fixed forward like a soldier awaiting orders in enemy territory. In front of him was a security desk, with an overhead light beaming directly down, illuminating every fine scratch on the nameplate pinned to his uniform. Ward E. A young man, perhaps not yet 30, dressed in a security uniform stepped forward. His face was cold, eyes squinting, his voice void of any respect. "You said you're a colonel?" Elijah nodded. "I can present all relevant documentation. This is a special assignment. I'm escorting the remains of Sergeant Mason Hayes, who was killed in Fallujah in 2022. The Department of Defense has approved all paperwork." "I know," the man replied absent-mindedly. "Just not used to seeing someone who looks like you wearing that many medals." Though spoken lightly, that sentence rang out like a gunshot in the airport. Elijah didn't reply immediately. He calmly removed his dress cap and placed it on the table. His eyes met the officer's, not with hatred, not with fear. Only the quiet resolve of a man who had crossed the line between life and death more than once. The security officer hesitated slightly but quickly masked it with his usual cold demeanor. He picked up the document folder and flipped through the pages rapidly as though searching for a flaw. "We need to inspect your medals and any personal items," he said, "including the burial flag." "That flag wrapped the body of the man who took a bullet for me," Elijah said, his voice low but steady. "I expect you to treat it with the minimum respect it deserves." No response. Another officer entered, a man with a buzz cut, sharp eyes, older. He didn't look at Elijah. He said coldly, "Place all items on the table." Elijah complied. He unpinned each medal and each combat ribbon, placing them carefully on the tabletop, as if laying down the bones of the fallen. He also removed a small item wrapped in an old handkerchief. Hayes' dog tag. Under the harsh fluorescent light, the steel engraving shimmered faintly in Elijah's eyes. "Hayes Mason, USMC, blood type O+, religion none." One of the two officers picked up the tag, turned it over, and then set it down without a word. Then the inspection began. Not the kind done professionally, but the type filled with spite, drawn out deliberately, every movement slow and purposeful, as if they meant to rip apart every layer of dignity Elijah carried. A medal slipped and fell to the floor. Elijah bent to pick it up, only to be stopped by the officer's hand. "Leave it. We'll handle it." "That's the Bronze Star," Elijah said, eyes locked on the small piece of metal. "Awarded after I pulled 3 teammates out of a firefight in Helmand, Afghanistan. They lived. But I've carried shrapnel in my lungs ever since." "Impressive," the officer replied with sarcasm. "But right now, you're just a passenger like everyone else." Elijah gave a faint smile, not from satisfaction, but from the weary familiarity with how society could reduce a man's worth based on skin color and circumstance. "I've never been like everyone else, and I've never asked for special treatment, but I didn't expect a colonel bringing home his fallen brother to be treated like a fraud." The man said nothing. After more than 20 minutes, the inspection ended. No apology, no explanation, just a flat, "You're free to go." Elijah stood. Before leaving, he reattached each medal to his chest, deliberately, as though stitching back together torn fabric on his pride. His hand trembled slightly as he pinned the Purple Heart. The memory of that shrapnel in Fallujah, the weeks in ICU, returning like a ghost. But he remained composed, silent, because he wouldn't let them see the toll. They didn't deserve to. He walked out of the room. The door closed behind him, like a thin mist falling over a deep wound, and he continued forward, still on the path, to fulfill a promise made to a man who had fallen for him. The metal door clanged shut behind Elijah Ward with a heavy thud. Surrounding him now was a small room. Gray walls, harsh fluorescent lights, no windows. The air was thick with the sterile stench of disinfectant and old metal. Elijah had once been pinned down in Taliban crossfire in Helmand, once buried in the fiery dust of Fallujah. But never, not once, had he felt his dignity so quietly and publicly stripped away as in this moment. Two security officers, a large bald man and a younger one, his face wound tight like a drawn bowstring, entered behind him. Neither spoke immediately. Elijah stood tall, eyes forward, the posture of a senior officer even as he was being treated like a suspect. "Place both hands on the table," the bald man said, his tone flat but frigid. Elijah placed his hands on the cold steel surface. The feeling of metal on their skin reminded him that no battlefield valor would be acknowledged here. Only skin color would be judged. "Spread your legs." He complied. The patience he had forged over 25 years of military service now had to be summoned, for a search not of security, but of pride. The inspection began. Slow, methodical, not out of professionalism, but to prolong the moment, as if their power was measured not by reason, but by humiliation. When they reached the medals pinned on Elijah's chest, the younger officer smiled. "Bronze Star? And a Purple Heart too? You think those make you a superhero or something?" Elijah gave no reply. His gaze remained steady, but inside, the memories of war roared to life. He remembered Hayes collapsing amid an artillery barrage, the ragged breathing, the bloodied hand gripping his own, and those final words, "If I don't make it back, bring me home." And now that promise was being trampled by men who had never known war, never understood sacrifice, armed only with suspicion and ignorant prejudice. "The scar on your back, where's that from?" the bald officer asked, squinting. "Fallujah. Shrapnel to the right lung," Elijah answered, his tone unchanged. The man nodded, not out of respect, but like he was appraising inventory. "We need to inspect the burial flag as well." Elijah froze for a beat. His eyes blinked slowly. That flag was sacred, folded by hand in a military funeral rite, presented to the fallen's family as the final symbol of honor. "No one touches that flag unless authorized," Elijah said, his voice low but firm. "It's not luggage. It's dignity." The officer ignored him. He unzipped the flag bag, pulled it out, and quickly shook it, as if checking the fabric. Elijah closed his eyes, lips pressed tight. Anywhere else, any other time, he might have shouted. But he knew that even the slightest reaction could be spun as resisting an officer. And Mason wouldn't forgive him if he let emotion override reason. The search concluded. Nothing was found. "You're free to go," the bald man said. Still no apology. Elijah quietly folded the flag, adjusting every crease according to ritual. His hands trembled slightly, not out of fear, but from the searing pain of having his honor assaulted to its core. He reattached each medal, buttoned his jacket, and positioned his cap. His posture returned to the solid bearing of a pillar in the storm. Before leaving, Elijah looked directly at the two men. His eyes weren't angry, just piercingly cold. "I once pulled a fellow soldier out of a burning vehicle in the Helmand kill zone. My arm was broken at the time. That man was white. I didn't see skin color. I saw a brother in arms." He paused, then turned to the camera in the corner of the room. "Maybe you should learn to see people, not just uniforms or skin tones." Without waiting for a response, Elijah walked out of the room. Each step was a resurrection from the ashes of humiliation, and he knew he could not fall. Not today, not while carrying the final promise of a friend who had died for him. The metal door closed behind Elijah Ward with a heavy click, like a punctuation mark ending a bitter chapter. But he had barely taken a few steps when he suddenly heard the echo of military boots. Heavy, rhythmic, and unmistakably familiar to anyone who had lived a soldier's life. A raspy, deep voice called out from the far end of the hallway. "I thought I wasn't mistaken. Elijah Ward, Colonel of Fallujah, right?" Elijah stopped. He turned around. At the end of the hallway, A gray-haired man approached among the bustling crowd of travelers, slightly hunched but with eyes sharp as a blade. On the breast of his blazer, a veteran's pin glinted under the airport lights. Elijah recognized him instantly. "Walter Harris," he whispered, as if not believing his own eyes. Walter, retired Navy lieutenant colonel, had once commanded a joint task force in the Kosovo campaign, nearly 2 decades ago. Back then, Elijah had been a young captain, and Walter was the commanding officer who had pulled him from under a collapsed wall during a nighttime assault. They had lost contact after that operation, each going their separate ways, living separate lives. "I heard you transferred to lead a Marine unit in Fallujah," Walter said as he approached, extending his hand. "But I never imagined that the next time I saw you, you'd be in full dress uniform, standing in an airport like your honor had just been stripped away." Elijah shook his hand, still dazed. "I'm just trying to bring a friend home," Elijah replied. "But every step I take here feels like walking through a minefield of prejudice." Walter nodded, his expression tightening. This country still hasn't learned how to see a soldier without seeing skin color first. He glanced toward the security room, where Elijah had just been frisked like a criminal. "And we've let it go on far too long." At that moment, a young security officer approached. His expression remained blank. "Sir, please don't gather near the control area. I need you and your guest to move along." Walter turned, pulling a small card from his coat pocket, blue, with a gold seal, the priority ID for officers who served in foreign wars. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Walter Harris, formerly commander of NATO Special Ops in Kosovo. I'm here with Colonel Ward, the man you humiliated without anyone in your department realizing who he is." The officer hesitated, glancing between Elijah and the card in Walter's hand. I was following protocol," he mumbled. "The problem," Walter replied calmly, each word cutting like steel, "is that protocol no longer sees us as people. When I pulled a black soldier from a collapsed building in Pristina, I didn't ask what color he was. I only knew he was my teammate." Walter turned, patting Elijah's shoulder. "He's the man keeping a final promise, and now he's keeping it to the end." Elijah gave a faint smile, but his eyes, softened and burning brighter, revealed something stirring beneath the surface. Walter's presence was like a breath of air in a suffocating room, a living testament that brotherhood in war rises above every barrier. "I didn't think I needed to meet an old friend here," Elijah said. "You didn't need to meet me," Walter replied. "But I think America needs to see this, that sacrifice has no color, and honor can't be stripped by a suspicious glance." The two walked toward the departure gate, passing rows of silent passengers. Some eyes turned to Elijah again, but this time not with curiosity, but with shame, because walking beside him was another older white soldier whose eyes radiated nothing but respect. A group of airport staff noticed them from afar. One of them muttered, "Damn, I think we messed with the wrong guy." Elijah sat down in a waiting area seat, Walter beside him. Together they stared through the glass wall toward a gray sky. Neither spoke, but in their silence, something spoke for them. Memory, recognition, and a belief that even if America forgets, those who once held each other's hands through enemy fire would never forget one another. The metal door closed behind Elijah Ward with a heavy click, like a punctuation mark ending a bitter chapter. But he had barely taken a few steps when he suddenly heard the echo of military boots. Heavy, rhythmic, and unmistakably familiar to anyone who had lived a soldier's life. A raspy, deep voice called out from the far end of the hallway. "I thought I wasn't mistaken. Elijah Ward, Colonel of Fallujah, right?" Elijah stopped. He turned around. At the end of the hallway, A gray-haired man approached among the bustling crowd of travelers, slightly hunched but with eyes sharp as a blade. On the breast of his blazer, a veteran's pin glinted under the airport lights. Elijah recognized him instantly. "Walter Harris," he whispered, as if not believing his own eyes. Walter, retired Navy lieutenant colonel, had once commanded a joint task force in the Kosovo campaign, nearly 2 decades ago. Back then, Elijah had been a young captain, and Walter was the commanding officer who had pulled him from under a collapsed wall during a nighttime assault. They had lost contact after that operation, each going their separate ways, living separate lives. "I heard you transferred to lead a Marine unit in Fallujah," Walter said as he approached, extending his hand. "But I never imagined that the next time I saw you, you'd be in full dress uniform, standing in an airport like your honor had just been stripped away." Elijah shook his hand, still dazed. "I'm just trying to bring a friend home," Elijah replied. "But every step I take here feels like walking through a minefield of prejudice." Walter nodded, his expression tightening. This country still hasn't learned how to see a soldier without seeing skin color first. He glanced toward the security room, where Elijah had just been frisked like a criminal. "And we've let it go on far too long." At that moment, a young security officer approached. His expression remained blank. "Sir, please don't gather near the control area. I need you and your guest to move along." Walter turned, pulling a small card from his coat pocket, blue, with a gold seal, the priority ID for officers who served in foreign wars. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Walter Harris, formerly commander of NATO Special Ops in Kosovo. I'm here with Colonel Ward, the man you humiliated without anyone in your department realizing who he is." The officer hesitated, glancing between Elijah and the card in Walter's hand. I was following protocol," he mumbled. "The problem," Walter replied calmly, each word cutting like steel, "is that protocol no longer sees us as people. When I pulled a black soldier from a collapsed building in Pristina, I didn't ask what color he was. I only knew he was my teammate." Walter turned, patting Elijah's shoulder. "He's the man keeping a final promise, and now he's keeping it to the end." Elijah gave a faint smile, but his eyes, softened and burning brighter, revealed something stirring beneath the surface. Walter's presence was like a breath of air in a suffocating room, a living testament that brotherhood in war rises above every barrier. "I didn't think I needed to meet an old friend here," Elijah said. "You didn't need to meet me," Walter replied. "But I think America needs to see this. That sacrifice has no color, and honor can't be stripped by a suspicious glance." The two walked toward the departure gate, passing rows of silent passengers. Some eyes turned to Elijah again, but this time not with curiosity, but with shame, because walking beside him was another older white soldier whose eyes radiated nothing but respect. A group of airport staff noticed them from afar. One of them muttered, "Damn, I think we messed with the wrong guy." Elijah sat down in a waiting area seat, Walter beside him. Together they stared through the glass wall toward a gray sky. Neither spoke, but in their silence, something spoke for them. Memory, recognition, and a belief that even if America forgets, those who once held each other's hands through enemy fire would never forget one another. "You can't go in. Restricted area." Elijah held out his paperwork. "I'm authorized. The remains of Sergeant Hayes are being stored here." The guard glanced over the papers, then smirked. "Next time, bring someone who looks like an officer." The words rang cold in the warehouse air. Elijah stood still, his face like stone. No rage, no outburst. Just one thing. Silent, deep contempt. "Call your supervisor," he said. A few minutes later, the cargo supervisor arrived, a middle-aged man, graying, eyes ringed with fatigue. Elijah explained everything, this time with a voice carrying the day's long-held restraint. I need confirmation that the casket is being handled to military protocol. I have already endured more disrespect today than I should. I'm not here to ask. I'm here to protect a soldier who died for this country. The supervisor looked at him for a few moments, then nodded. Something in Elijah's eyes told him this wasn't a matter of logistics, but a moral test. "Follow me," he said. When the main storage door opened, Elijah immediately recognized Mason's casket, a heavy oak box draped in the American flag, shoved to the side next to miscellaneous freight. There were no barricades, no signs of honor. Nearby, a worker was having lunch, on a crate beside the casket. Elijah's chest tightened. He walked over and straightened the flag, gently smoothing out its folds as if he were touching his friend's skin one last time. "Mason," he whispered, "I'm still here. Don't worry." Another worker approached as if to say something, but when he met Elijah's eyes, he stopped and turned away. As Elijah exited the warehouse, he felt something had broken. Not just trust, but a threshold he had long tried to hold firm. The truth was that they hadn't just insulted him. They had dishonored Mason. Elijah Ward left the cargo facility with a heavy heart, and their steps weighed more than the decorated uniform on his body. He didn't look back. He couldn't, because if he did, he feared he might see himself shatter right there in the airport. When he re-entered the waiting lounge, the bright lights made him feel even more like a shadow, invisible amidst an indifferent crowd, in the middle of an indifferent system. Walter Harris waited at the end of the hallway. The older man leaned against a column, arms folded across his chest, his eyes watching Elijah like a father seeing his son return from a battle he couldn't intervene in. "You found him, didn't you?" Walter asked, his voice low. Elijah nodded silently. Then he recounted every little detail. The flag-draped casket misplaced beside industrial cargo boxes, with no protective barriers, no personnel standing by. A worker casually resting his foot on a crate nearby, while eating lunch. The insult lay not just in how people looked, but in every small, indifferent action. Walter gripped his cane tighter, his aged eyes blurring. The price of sacrifice, now placed beside boxes of frozen food. Just then, a teenage boy, around 17, approached the phone trembling. "You're the one they held up this morning, right? In the security area?" Elijah nodded. I managed to record part of it. I already posted it." Elijah looked at him, stunned. The boy awkwardly held up the screen. On it was a video of Elijah being questioned, stripped of his medals, the funeral flag and Mason's dog tags being inspected, with the headline, "A Black Colonel Humiliated While Escorting His Fallen Comrade Home. #Justice for Colonel Ward." In just 3 hours, the video had over 450,000 views. The comments poured in. "How can they treat a soldier like this? He doesn't deserve that indifference. Neither does his friend. We need to rise. #No. Officer left behind." A part of Elijah wanted to ask the boy to take it down. He never sought the spotlight. But then he stopped, because a different voice came from behind. "We saw the video," said a middle-aged woman, followed by a group of people making their way to the main concourse, holding handmade signs. "We're here to say, you're not alone." Their signs read, "No officer left behind. Honor knows no skin color. Elijah Ward, we stand with you." At first, just a few, then dozens, then hundreds. Within 45 minutes, the main airport hall became a gathering point for a wave of outrage, yet full of order. Veterans arrived in faded uniforms, bearing medals and black and white photos of fallen comrades. College students wore printed hashtags on their shirts. Families who had lost loved ones in the military brought white flowers. Walter Harris glanced around. his eyes shining behind faded white lashes. "It's been a long time since I've seen something like this, Elijah. Not a victory, but an awakening." The airport's executive board immediately called an emergency meeting. They were not prepared for a tsunami of justice spreading across the media. Major news outlets began live coverage from the airport. CNN, NBC, and the New York Times were all present. On social media, #Justice for Colonel Ward became the #1 trending topic nationwide within 6 hours. Politicians began speaking out. Some senators issued public apologies. Veteran organizations demanded a thorough investigation into how soldiers of color were treated in civilian environments. And Elijah still sat there beside Walter, beside the small military-issued suitcase containing Mason Hayes' personal belongings and the neatly folded flag, like a vow, yet unfinished. No one dared approach to question him anymore. No one dared to ask if he was truly a colonel. The truth had spoken for him, and for the first time, he didn't have to raise his voice to be seen. That evening, a representative from the Pentagon, General Malcolm Stokes, called Elijah. "I heard, Ward. They had no right to lay hands on your honor like that. There's a lot we need to talk about, not just about you, but the entire system." Elijah replied in a quiet voice, "I'm not trying to start a war, sir. I'm just trying to keep a promise." General Stokes was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "And maybe that's exactly why you have to speak." That day, honor wasn't restored by an apology. The gaze of hundreds of strangers restored it, a community united through righteous anger and the unyielding resilience of a man who just wanted to bring his friend home. The lights in the airport terminal cast down on Elijah Ward's face, now the center of an uncontrollable storm. From social media and television to phones constantly recording footage, all eyes were on a man in uniform who had kept his promise while the system he had served tried to break him. Social media ignited like a dry forest catching fire. #Justice for Colonel Ward #. Bring him home #. Honor all soldiers #. Not just uniform, millions of shares. Hundreds of thousands of comments, not out of pity, but collective rage. If this is how America treats a black colonel, what's left of justice? He didn't ask to be honored. He just wanted his friend to return home like a human being. Honor has no color, and a promise should never be stopped by paperwork and prejudice. Veterans began writing open letters. Those who had served alongside Elijah shared wartime photos, one taken in Fallujah, Elijah carrying Mason Hayes on his back, blood trailing down his arm under a storm of bullets. A Marine named Coleman wrote, "I was there. I saw Elijah Ward push our team out of the ambush and return for Mason's body. He doesn't need medals. He needs honor, for both of them." The story spread beyond borders. Newspapers in the UK, France, and Canada reported on it. An Asian American journalist commented, "I used to think racism in the military was a thing of the past. Turns out, it just changed form." Meanwhile, inside the airport, the demonstration continued. But it wasn't loud chants or violence. It was a silence that cut deep. Hundreds wore shirts printed with the image of a folded flag, holding photos of deceased loved ones, those who had gone to war and were forgotten when they returned. A 12-year-old boy, wearing a white dress shirt, stood beside his parents holding a handwritten sign. "Uncle Elijah, thank you for keeping your promise. When I grow up, I want to be like you." Elijah looked at the boy, eyes welling. A lifetime of service, thousands of hours in combat. No accolade had ever struck him as profoundly as those words. At that moment, a reporter approached cautiously. "Colonel Ward, would you like to share anything with the public? They're listening." Elijah was silent for a moment. He looked out at the crowd, not supporters, but expectant eyes, wanting him to say something, not to stir, but to heal. Finally, he nodded. He stepped up onto a plastic chair, stood in the center of the crowd, and spoke. Just a few sentences, but they sliced through the silence like a blade. I'm not standing here for myself. I'm standing for the friend who fell so I could live. I'm standing for those who kept their oath, but came home to be seen as impostors. If honor is granted only by the color of skin, then it's no longer honor. It's privilege. Silence. Then thunderous applause. Walter Harris wiped his tears. A young officer nearby whispered, "That's the speech America needed. Not from words, but through action." In Washington, D.C., General Malcolm Stokes stood in his office, eyes fixed on the live broadcast. He picked up the phone. "Get me the Secretary of Defense's office, now." Influential figures began speaking out. A congresswoman from Illinois, the daughter of a veteran, announced she would introduce legislation mandating mandatory training for all civilian airport staff on how to interact with military personnel. The National Veterans Organization sent a letter to Elijah Ward. "You are not alone, and you've woken us from indifference." As for Elijah, he returned to the airport bench, sitting beside the old steel suitcase containing Mason Hayes' personal belongings, his hands resting on the funeral flag, palms trembling slightly. On the phone in his pocket, notifications continued to flash, but he didn't check them. He only needed to know one thing. Mason was still waiting, and the promise was still unfinished. Elijah Ward's phone vibrated nonstop. Amid the clamor of protest chants, flight announcements, and echoed voices through the airport PA system, he nearly missed the call that would change everything. Unknown caller, Pentagon's secure line. Elijah hesitated for a second, then answered. "Colonel Ward." "Elijah, it's me, Malcolm Stokes." Even over the phone, Elijah stood at attention. General Stokes was more than just a superior. He had once commanded Elijah during the brutal campaigns in Afghanistan. He was the one who had called Elijah the only moral compass in a battalion sinking into hell. "I saw it," Stokes said, voice hoarse but firm. "This damn airport should be ashamed. And you kept your word. Are you still there?" "Yes, sir, but they're still delaying everything. I'm afraid Hayes still hasn't been given the place he deserves." General Stokes went silent for a moment, then said, "I won't let them touch your honor, Elijah. I'll call the Department of Transportation, the commander of the Air Force, and anyone who needs to hear it. They picked the wrong man to disrespect." The call ended. Elijah looked around, and for the first time that day, he felt like he wasn't alone. Less than 30 minutes later, the entire atmosphere at JFK International Airport had changed. From the East Gate, a group of uniformed veterans arrived, 7 of them, from different battalions, of various races, nationalities, and religions. But they shared one thing. They had fought with or under Elijah Ward. Leading them was Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Brooks, whom Elijah had once saved from an artillery strike in Helmand in 2008. "We heard from the Veteran Network. It took exactly 2 hours to gather our people, grab our old uniforms, and get here," Brooks said, eyes locked on Elijah. "You led us when fire closed in from all sides. Now, we'll stand with you amid this social firestorm." They lined up before the information desk and requested to speak to the highest-ranking airport official. One of them, Major Castillo, said just one thing. "When one of us is disrespected, all of us are disrespected." As the soldiers stood in solidarity, the media was already there. Cameras rolled, flashbulbs exploded. This time, no one could deny the weight of their presence. Simultaneously, the Pentagon released a statement via social media and television. "We are launching an urgent investigation into the mishandling of Colonel Elijah Ward. The Pentagon reaffirms its commitment to zero tolerance for racial discrimination, especially toward active duty or honor-bound military personnel." General Stokes also issued a personal declaration. Elijah Ward is one of the most courageous and ethical officers I have ever commanded. The fact that he was humiliated while returning a fallen brother is unacceptable. I will see this matter through to the end. In the main terminal, a U.S. Air Mobility Command representative arrived, Lieutenant General Grace Monroe. She was the first female general to lead a special combat unit and knew Elijah Ward's name. She stepped in front of him and extended her hand. On behalf of the entire military, I apologize to you, Colonel Ward, and I will personally oversee the transport of Sergeant Hayes' remains. Elijah gripped her hand, eyes welling. All the humiliation he'd endured was now being shared, not with promises, but with presence. Outside, the protest transformed. It was no longer just about anger, but solidarity. Hundreds of veterans joined in. They didn't wave angry signs. They stood in formation, solemn and silent, each holding a photo of a fallen comrade. From above, the TV news drone captured a breathtaking image, a long line of veterans from many generations, from Vietnam, Iraq to Syria, all standing together under one banner. When one falls, we all bring them home. Elijah looked at the scene, heart tight in his chest. He was no longer a lone soldier trying to protect a friend. He had become the face of a generation of warriors, long forgotten by the system, now named and remembered by truth and loyalty. As the group left the terminal to prepare for the honor flight, a female reporter tried to step forward. Colonel Ward, do you feel your honor has been restored? Elijah paused, eyes fixed on the casket now being readied for transport. Honor isn't something that can be lost, unless you give it up. And I never gave it up. Dawn broke. As sunlight peeked through thin clouds, a C-17 Globemaster III military transport aircraft lifted off from JFK International Airport, carrying the body of Sergeant Mason Hayes and his friend, who had kept his promise to the very end, Colonel Elijah Ward. The cargo hold was utterly silent. The flag-draped casket was placed in the most honorable position, flanked by 2 honor guards standing at attention. Elijah sat nearby, back straight, hands on his thighs, eyes locked on the flag covering his old friend. There was no sound except the steady hum of jet engines and the faint whisper of wind brushing against the fuselage. But inside Elijah, memories stirred, each footstep across the burning sands of Fallujah, gunfire cracking like thunder, and the moment when Mason Hayes threw himself forward, pushing Elijah out of harm's way before collapsing. If I don't make it back, take me home. That promise was no longer a burden. It had become a mission fulfilled with blood, resilience, and unbreakable brotherhood. The early morning mist lingered when the plane landed in the small town of Ashfield, where Mason had grown up. Beyond the security fence, hundreds of locals stood waiting, not for the media or spectacle, but out of respect for a son of the town who had made the ultimate sacrifice. An Army honor guard lined the runway, uniforms crisp, rifles shouldered. As the casket was carried from the plane, each soldier saluted in unison, a sacred ritual reserved for those who had fallen in battle. Elijah followed, every step heavy with the weight of the past. A funeral home staff member bowed and handed him the neatly folded burial flag. Elijah accepted it with both hands, steady, refusing to tremble. Emotions surged, but his face remained composed, like a soldier trained to stand firm in the crossfire, but now fighting a different kind of war, with tears. At Ashfield Military Cemetery, the ceremony occurred under maple trees, tinged with deep red. Chairs had been set out. Neighbors, old classmates of Mason, veterans, and civic groups, all were present. At the front were Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, Mason's parents, hands trembling as they held a photo of their son in uniform. Mrs. Hayes reached out when she saw Elijah approach, saying nothing, only clutching him tightly. He always believed you'd bring him home. I promised, Elijah whispered, and I kept that promise. Her body sagged slightly in his arms as she wept, not in the arms of a blood relative, but of a true brother, defined not by birth, but by the battlefield. The memorial began with the haunting notes of taps, the farewell to fallen soldiers. As the first notes rang out, everyone stood. Elijah raised his hand in salute, utterly composed, his eyes never leaving the flag-draped casket. The flag was folded, each crease precise, every motion aligned with military tradition. A young officer stepped forward to present it to Mrs. Hayes, accompanied by the regulation words, "On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, we present this flag in recognition of your son's honorable and faithful service." Mrs. Hayes could no longer hold back her tears. When it came time to speak, Elijah stepped forward. The wind stirred the hem of his uniform, but he stood unmoved, like a monument. Mason Hayes was a soldier, yes, but more than that, he was the friend I trusted most. In Fallujah, we didn't see skin color or rank, only life and death. And in that fleeting moment, he chose to protect me instead of himself. He paused, then continued. He is the reason I'm alive, and also the reason I cannot, will not accept anyone anywhere dishonoring this soldier, whether by accident or intent. Today I didn't just bring him home. I brought a piece of my soul to rest with him. Elijah bowed his head. Silence fell over the grounds. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, Mrs. Hayes pulled Elijah aside and handed him a weathered envelope. "He left this for you, before he deployed." Elijah took it, opened it, and read in silence, "If I fall, I know you'll bring me home, but don't just bring my body, bring the truth. If they ever do to you what we feared, don't stay silent. Fight back, with the dignity we once fought for in war." The letter, like a torch passed between hands. That afternoon, Elijah stood alone among the rows of gravestones. Before him were the names of hundreds of soldiers, and now one more. Mason Hayes, warrior, brother, keeper of the promise. He placed his hand on the headstone and whispered, "I've completed the mission, but your message is a new mission." I will not be silent. Late afternoon, a soft yellow light spilt from the windows of the Hayes family's small house, filtering through thin curtains. Inside, the atmosphere was silent, but warm. No more funeral bulges, helicopters, or marching boots. Just the gentle clinking of spoons on porcelain, the sound of tea being poured into a chipped cup, and stories of a son who was no longer present. Elijah sat at the corner of the table, holding a cup of hot tea Mrs. Hayes had just given him. He spoke little, not because he lacked things to say, but because some pain could only be shared through silence. Yet every time his eyes drifted to the photo of Mason on the mantel, they trembled slightly. Mrs. Hayes returned with a small wooden box. She sat down, opened the lid, and pulled out a yellowed envelope. "He wrote this before he left." Her voice drifted with memory, and said if anything happened, I should give it to you. Elijah received it with both hands, not rushing to open it. Just touching the envelope made his heartbeat slow. "May I read it in private?" he asked softly. Mrs. Hayes nodded. Behind the house was a small patch of grass where Mason used to play baseball as a child. Elijah went out, sat beneath the maple tree's shade, and opened the letter. The paper had yellowed. The handwriting remained strong, but the creases showed it had once been crumpled and smoothed out again. "Elijah, if you're reading this, then the worst has happened, and if I know you as well as I think I do, which I do, you're blaming yourself. Don't. We both knew what could happen out there, but I have no regrets. If I had to choose again, I'd still push you out of the blast. I didn't write this to make you sad. I wrote it to give you one last mission. If you manage to bring me home, then great. But if they treat you the way we always feared they might, the suspicious looks, the disrespect, even if you're wearing stars on your collar, then don't stay silent. I know you. You always choose restraint. But this time, don't speak, tell the story. Not for me, but for those like us, the ones who'll still wear the uniform, with skin color that gets judged before their rank. Live for both of us, Eli. Do the right thing. Mason Elijah folded the letter slowly, then pressed it to his chest. Like a final set of marching orders, that letter hadn't come over the radio, hadn't come from command, but from the deepest places of loyalty and brotherhood. That night, he stayed in Mason's old bedroom, untouched since Mason enlisted. On the wall were posters of his childhood baseball team, a few high school certificates, and a photo of them together at the base in Afghanistan. Both were younger, smiling, when the world still felt whole. Elijah stared at the ceiling. He couldn't sleep. Everything in that house made him feel as if Mason was still there, from the old guitar beside the bed to the jacket still hanging behind the door. He opened the letter again. Could you read it? And this time, he cried, not from pain, but because the time had come to turn love into action. The next morning, Elijah returned to the cemetery, not to stand and salute, but to speak, alone. I kept my promise, Mason, he said quietly, but now I'm making another. I won't let you be forgotten, and let what happened to me become normal for those who wear this uniform. I know I'll lose sleep and be exhausted, but I'm ready. The wind blew gently. A golden leaf brushed his shoulder. Elijah's eyes stayed fixed on the headstone. Now, you rest. I'll keep marching. That night, Elijah began writing the opening lines of an op-ed to submit to the New York Times. I'm an Army colonel who brought a fallen brother home, but I'm also a black man, treated like an intruder at the very airport of the country I served. He paused, looked at Mason's letter beside him. And I will not stay silent any longer. 2 weeks after laying Mason to rest, Elijah Ward stepped out of an old Jeep and looked up at a red brick building in the heart of downtown Charlotte, North Carolina. On the newly lit sign above the entrance, it read, "The Hayes Foundation, for honor, for equity, for the forgotten." A gentle breeze passed, lifting away some of the sorrow lingering in him. This place was not some cold administrative office. It was a sanctuary where families of fallen soldiers of color could receive support, not just financial, but also psychological, legal, and dignitary. Elijah had put in all his reward money and medals, and even sold some of his family lands to establish the organization. And true to its name, he raised it under the banner of his fallen friend. News of Elijah's journey from airport to graveside had spread nationwide. It was no longer a personal story, but a symbol for thousands of unseen cases buried beneath the system. Within 3 months, dozens of letters flooded the foundation. Some came from mothers who had never received a single apology for the deaths of their sons. Others were young soldiers who recounted the suspicious looks they received at airports, even while in uniform with valid identification. Some were from white individuals, apologizing for their silence and asking to be part of changing something. Elijah wasn't just a founder. He drafted petitions to Congress proposing an amendment requiring all U.S. international airports to implement mandatory training for airline and security personnel on how to receive the remains of fallen soldiers, and disciplinary measures for any racially biased conduct toward military personnel. He also collaborated with the Department of Defense to launch a program called Silent Valor, a platform for veterans of color to share their stories, recorded as documentaries, to be used as training material at military academies. 1 year after Mason's passing, Elijah returned to the cemetery, not alone this time. By his side were over 500 people, including young soldiers in uniform, wearing name tags, standing in long rows lining the path to Mason Hayes' grave. There were reporters, children holding handmade signs that read, "We salute every soldier, not every skin." The memorial didn't begin with the sound of a funeral bugle, but with a video montage recounting Elijah's journey, bringing Mason's body home. When the scene of him being detained at the airport played, the audience went silent. When the clip of him saluting beside the casket appeared, everyone stood. Elijah gave a short speech. "I once believed I only had one mission, to keep a promise to a friend. But now I understand. That promise wasn't just between me and Mason, but between me and everyone who has ever been dismissed after serving this country. We're not asking for privilege, only for dignity." The applause was thunderous, but Elijah knew that honor wasn't found in speeches, but in the actions that followed. The next day, Elijah received a call from the Pentagon. They invited him to serve as an advisor to the National Council for Reforming Honors for Fallen Soldiers. He declined. "I'll still help," he said, "but I need to be among the people, not behind closed doors." And so, he returned to the Foundation's office. He held the hand of a mother who had just lost her son in an airstrike. He sent an assistance package to the family of a soldier denied death benefits over a clerical error. He wrote a thank you letter to an airport security staffer who had handled a delicate situation with humanity, one task at a time, slowly but firmly. One day, Elijah received a handwritten letter. It came from a 14-year-old girl, the daughter of a fallen soldier. "I used to hate the color of my skin. I thought I could never be a hero. But after watching your video, I changed my mind. I'm going to enlist. And if I ever fall, I hope I have a friend like you, who keeps their promise until the very end." Elijah finished reading and looked to the sky. His eyes were red. His hand clutched the letter tightly. Then he placed the letter beside Mason's photo on his desk. "You see that, Hayes?" he whispered. "We're still marching.